Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Lee Lowry and I'm the Executive Director of the American School Health Association. Thank you for joining ASHA for today's webinar, Human Trafficking Awareness, Implications for Schools. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about ASHA. ASHA is the only organization that addresses multiple disciplines in school health and that is devoted solely to school health. Our membership of approximately 700 individuals represents school health as administrators at the local, state, and national level, as health and educational professionals in pre-K through 12 school settings, and as academics conducting research and preparing school health professionals. We're also the proud publishers of the Journal of School Health, a premier journal in the area of school and adolescent health. Members of ASHA can elect to receive a hard copy or an electronic copy of the journal. Our membership fee is inexpensive and provides you access to the journal and also to our biweekly e-newsletter, School Health Action, as well as free continuing education hours that through approved webinars like today's and through CE qualifying JOSH articles. If you haven't already, please consider joining, volunteering, and becoming a member of the ASHA community. Visit us at ashaweb.org to learn more. Our 2017 conference will be held between October 11th through the 13th in St. Louis, Missouri. Please join us to meet, share, and inspire ideas and conversation with like-minded school health professionals. 4 interdisciplinary-based tracks are offered during our conference, including administration, coordination, and leadership, programs and services, research and emerging issues, and teaching and learning. Our conference registration is now open, and our early bird rates are going to end on August 24th. So be sure to visit our conference page at ashaweb.org and learn more about the oral sessions, posters, roundtables, pre-conference sessions, and post-conference sessions that we are providing. As I mentioned, the continuing education credit for today's webinar is free for all members. If you are a non-member and you would like to receive CE credit for this webinar, the cost is $30. After the webinar, you can receive 1 Category 1 CE/CH for MCHES and CHES, 1 contact hour for continuing nursing education, or a certificate of attendance based on 70% or more participation today. Participation is measured by the amount of time the webinar remains active on your screen. We'll provide details for obtaining CE in a post-webinar email that will go out in the next few days. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, I'd like to share a little bit about a framework that unites ASHA's very diverse membership. ASHA believes that schools have a responsibility to meet the needs of the whole child. The whole school, whole community, whole child, or WSCC model, developed jointly by the CDC and ASCD, provides a framework for the health and ed sectors at the state and local levels to work towards stronger alignment, integration, and collaboration. This approach puts the student in the center to ensure that all students are safe, healthy, engaged, supported, and challenged. This holistic and synergistic approach requires schools, students, families, and community partners to focus on improving both health and educational outcomes, and to create schools that nurture and support all students. It is a team effort, and collaboration is the key to success. A multidisciplinary approach that involves school nurses, counselors, health educators, physical educators, community experts, administrators, and students can better leverage resources and expertise to address the needs of the whole child, meeting the child's physical, emotional, social, and academic needs. Using the knowledge and wisdom of this school health team and research, schools can develop policies and programs that support all students, keep them safe from physical or emotional harm, and empower them to take responsibility for their own health and well-being. In coordination with the CDC and the National Association of Chronic Disease Directors, ASHA published a special issue of JOSH on the WSCC model that was published in November 2015, and it's available via open access. We will send the link we'll send the link to this special issue to you in our follow-up email. All of ASHA's webinars tie back to this model, and today's topic of human trafficking awareness implications for schools is no exception. Today's session focuses on health services, counseling, psychological and social services, and family engagement of the WISC model. A couple of notes before we begin. Your phones will remain muted for the 60-minute duration of this webinar. If you have any questions, please type them in the questions box on the screen, and we will try to address them at the end of the presentation. We're recording today's session, and we will send you a link to the recording, also to the evaluation survey and to the slides within the next couple of days. Now, let's get started with an introduction of Rhonda Hertwig. Rhonda is currently an itinerant school nurse through RCM Health Services, which is contracted by the Hawaii Department of Education to provide nursing services to special needs students on the island. She has over 25 years experience as an RN, with 16 years as a PNP. The majority of clinical practice has been in the outpatient primary care role. She has a tremendous respect for the role of the school nurse and thus has an interest in school-based health care and collaboration with school nursing to improve health and academic outcomes. Over the last several years, she has volunteered on humanitarian medical missions to Vietnam. It was during her mission service and volunteer work with the U.S.-based organization that she developed a huge interest on the topic of human trafficking. Rhonda feels that it is of utmost urgency that as a nation, we begin to understand trauma-informed care as a framework for our schools. Thank you, Rhonda, for leading today's webinar. Now I'm just going to change the presentation mode over to you.
Okay.
And you can, hopefully you can see that on your screen now.
Show my screen. Okay, so are you seeing that now, Lee?
I do see it. I think you want to get it into presentation mode if you can.
How do I do that?
Okay. It's hard for me to see on your screen, but the slideshow tab to the, if you look at the top, kind of move over.
Okay.
Keep moving over. You see where it says slideshow next to animations?
Okay, animations. Okay, yes, ma'am. Okay. All right, that's right.
Wait, now it needs to.
Are we at the beginning now? Is that better?
That'll do just fine. I can't. There's a slideshow tab at the top there, and if you click on it.
Okay.
Right there.
And
then stay from the beginning or something, or
from the start. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
All
there
right.
you go. It's good.
Oh,
it's good.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay. All right. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for taking the time out today, and thank you, Lee, for that introduction. I just want to say that just give you a side story of more that got me started on this journey to find out more about human trafficking. And I'm going to be pretty brief because we've got a lot to cover here. But it started several years back on one of my medical humanitarian missions with the providers from who were all Vietnam vets. But I saw a lot while I was in Southeast Asia, and it just broke my heart. And at the time, I didn't even know there was such a thing as human trafficking, let alone in our own country, in our own backyard. So that led me to do more inquiry into it, and I hope to share with you my little bit of knowledge that I have about it, and in hopes that with the goal making you more aware so that no more children are victimized. So with that, we'll get started. I have no disclosures. The only disclosure I have is that my husband keeps telling me I can't save the world from all the injustices, but we can all do our small little part. So moving on to the overview. Whoops. Sorry. Just some main points that we'll review today. We're going to go through a lot of definitions. I'm going to briefly mention the ACE study. I know many of you on here now are familiar with that and the results and what's being done with that. We're going to talk about trauma in the form of toxic stress. We're going to talk about our roles as individuals, the role of our school as a whole, and our communities, and then talk about some other considerations. So just a quick slide. As far as, like I said, I've been there. I've been the school nurse. I know we have a lot of issues that are out there now. I've seen and heard so much about the opioid epidemic. While it's important, there are other pressing issues, such as our awareness of sexual exploitation and what we can do about that. And it's my hope that that we start to see more of that, or move in that direction. Learning objectives, again, we talked about what the definitions, what exactly is human trafficking, understanding that link between trauma and the impact and the outcomes. Talk about a few legislative or policy initiatives and how they relate back to the trauma-informed movement that is taking place, and then discussion of our roles. So everybody wants to see a few numbers. This is from the Polaris Project, and there aren't going to be a whole lot of numbers. When you're talking about a hidden crime and a lack of a database, at least for right now, you don't have a lot of numbers. Suffice it to say that it does affect every nation and all 50 states in our country. The majority of victims are U.S. residents. It brings in $32 billion in revenue for these trafficking networks. An average child can bring in $500 to $1,000 a day. So when you're talking about them being used up to 10, 15 times a day, you can see where those dollars mount up. Right now, the only figures I've seen are anywhere between 100 and 300,000 in the U.S. 1 in 8 runaways becoming a victim. We'll talk about that. 70% of adults were trafficked in the beginning as a child. And the average age for girls is 12 to 14, boys 11 to 13, but all the reading and statistics report that as low as 9 years of age, which is appalling. Just a favorite quote of mine by Mandela that I love, and it's so rich in what it says. There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And that's pretty profound to me, and something that we need to think about it as a whole. Definitions, I've got several, as you can see, and we'll take them as I approach that particular topic throughout. And I just wanted to throw this slide in there, sort of food for thought, and I don't know, it must have been fate to run across this information recently, because I've been concerned or puzzled in my mind to the whole definition of human trafficking and what it is. I've not been happy with the way it reads, and neither are most folks at this point, and we'll talk about that. But the definition right now that I'm getting ready to present is it's centered around the perpetrator, not the actions of the actual crime against the victim, what they're experiencing. And what Dr. Stone says in her book on policy paradox, she sums it up with her quote: the way we think about problems is extremely sensitive to the language used to describe them. So by that, if we're not putting the words or the correct language into a definition, we're not going to respond to it. We're not going to react to it. And you'll see what I mean as we go forward. So human trafficking, our federal law, which is the TVPA, basically says it's the illegal trade of human beings, mainly for the purposes of forced labor and sex trafficking. And I'm going to skip labor trafficking for this talk. Another slide to the left and to the right is material from the Blue Campaign, which is the voice for the or the arm of Department of Homeland Security. I encourage you to go on that site. They have an incredible amount of information, and they do a lot of online training, and also have free material, one of which is what we call a shoe card or keychain card, and I'll show you that at the end, and it shows the actual hotline number that you can give to suspected victims. And the one on the lower left is just a picture I took when I got off the escalator in Atlanta Airport several years ago. So it was encouraging to see that the word is getting out there, and it'd be nice to see more of that. Another definition, breaking it down into child sex trafficking. Recruitment, harboring, transportation, although transportation does not have to be there. Provision or obtaining a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act. And we do not have to have the force, fraud, or coercion for those 18 and under. That is just for adults. Trauma. What is trauma? I'm going to use some interchangeable terms. Trauma, tragedy, adverse events, stress, chronic stress. We'll move into that. Basically, an event, an intense event that threatens our safety or security. And just to let you know, 61% of men and 51% of women surveyed report at least one traumatic event, as well as 1 in 4 children will have experienced a major traumatic event before the age of high school. More definitions. Toxic stress, again, we can call it complex trauma. It's strong, frequent, and prolonged adversity. So it's repeated trauma, repeated and repeated and repeated over and over and over again. And with this, I want to point out the couple of resources. The Center for Youth Wellness site founded by Dr. Burke, and you'll probably hear a lot of Dr. Burke if you continue in your efforts with the trafficking movement. She just created or launched a new initiative, National Pediatric Practice Community on ACEs, with the purpose of hopefully screening and providing better care for identifying and caring for these victims. So getting back to stress and the 3 levels, we all have been stressed. It's normal reaction. But it's how we sort of dose related. It can be very positive. It's supposed to be that way. We have mechanisms in our body that reacts to stress. We move in the middle to tolerable, but as we move on up, again, dose response, when it's repeated and repeated, there's no way your body and your mind can cope with that. And you develop toxicity, toxic levels, sort of like with a medication. Bullying, I don't really probably have to tell you about this definition. We've heard this one for years. Basically, unwanted aggressive behavior that involves a real or a perceived power imbalance. And it's also repeated and repeated. We'll talk about or the different types being verbal, social, physical. Social area is very important as it relates to the internet. We'll talk about that. It does occur at every grade level. And just another statistic, it happens to be the primary source of school shootings. 9 in 10 LGBTQ students experience verbal abuse. We'll talk more about the vulnerable population later, as well as 60% of students with disabilities. So just to give you a little flavor of the ACE study overview, it was a research study started in the mid-1990s. It's also noted, also known or has been said that it's the biggest epidemiological research study that has ever been done that no one knows about. I know I didn't. Involved 17,000 volunteers. Dr. Folletti, who was part of Kaiser Permanente health system, was overseeing an obesity clinic and looking at the health outcomes. He wondered why certain interventions weren't working, and I think a lot of the providers ask why things are not working. There must be a reason behind this. So yes, there was. They realized there was a connection to events, adverse events that happened in childhood before the age of 18 that affected them throughout their lifetime, or had the potential for affecting them throughout their lifetime. He eventually collaborated with Dr. Anda from the CDC, and thus created the birth of the Adverse Childhood Experience study. This is the ACE study framework model that takes you from conception to death, and the things that years ago we did not understand, but now do today due to technology. So we start out with our experiences, how it disrupts our neurobiology, how it affects our the way we behave, how it increases our risk-taking behaviors, and how all of this leads to disease, disability, social problems, and basically enable or poor quality of life, and then to early death. And while we're on this, just the top of the pyramid, another finding with sexual exploited children. As I mentioned before, they're exploited repeatedly in a day, up to 15 buyers. So that's 15 times a day they've been raped. So when you look at this on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis, ever how long they are enslaved, you can see why they have an early death of 7 years after being enslaved. So the ACE study results today, we can fast forward. We've learned a lot of information, again, due to technology and MRIs and just our understanding of behavior. It's a huge public health issue. Again, it's huge, but you wouldn't know it because it doesn't get that much press. The neurobiology research has been incredible. We're now able to look beneath the behavior and know what's causing a child to behave the way he is. It has set forth a whole trauma-informed care movement. We'll talk about some more. It has started, we have started looking at our juvenile justice system and our law enforcement and how they respond to areas such as runaways and truancy and other poor decision making among our youth. Trying to understand that it doesn't help them to be punished. They're not going to learn to change that behavior or understand that behavior by being isolated or confined or imprisoned. And then it has helped with our legislation. CDC now has a division of violence prevention that takes into account the ACE study. So it's remarkable what's happened and is happening today. We know it's intergenerational. Until we engage families, parents, caregivers, who themselves may have been victims or victims to chronic stress, and then it gets passed on to the next generation. So I mentioned before, 1 in 4 children have experienced a significant ACE. Just an example here of some research findings. A student with the 3 ACEs were 3 times greater to have academic failure, perhaps eventually be a school dropout, 6 times greater for behavioral problems, again leading them into the juvenile justice system and to be treated for problems, perhaps with medication, without ever addressing the underlying problem, and 5 times greater absenteeism for a number of reasons. So I wanted to put together a slide of what this neurobiology is in a nutshell. I know you've all experienced or heard about the fight or flight response, probably from elementary school. It's a normal stress response. We have certain things going on physiologically and neurologically with the surge of hormones and neurotransmitters, but it goes away very quickly. As quickly as it comes on, it goes away. It's there, it's needed, but when it's chronic, it becomes not so normal, and that's when we call it, toxic stress, complex trauma. The messages to our brain to release these hormones basically causes our response system to stay in a high mode, constantly on. It begins to weaken your immune system, our organ systems, our brain, changes our brain architecture. sort of equate it to a car engine that's constantly revved up with the accelerator all the way down. It's only going to last so long before it shuts down. So you have this chronic activation that damages some of the synapses in our brain. So with the knowledge that we've learned from the neurobiology, we know it's there for our protection. But it's that chronic stress, again, that is ever so present, that doesn't go away, and causes us to be in a constant state of alertness or alarm or being afraid. So you can look at that and understand why a child perhaps is behaving the way he is. Are they feeling safe? I don't think so. There are basic underlying issues, which goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of do we have shelter? Are we cared for? Does somebody care about me? Do we have enough to eat? When you have those type of issues on a daily basis, it explains it all. And I just wanted to also point out the two leading authorities and one of their books related to this topic on neuroplasticity. So how is it that it happens in our school systems? Well, we've talked about the bullying, the cyberbullying, and the grooming process. The grooming takes place in a way of manipulation, intimidation. The human trafficking network is big business, and the people they employ are trained in the grooming, intimidation business. Recruitment takes place on our school grounds, as well as in our neighborhoods and on our internet. 9 in 10 teens are online daily. If they're not on their phones, they're on their computers. At some point, they're going to get solicited by someone trying to exploit them. And of course, we have to take into the developmental changes that children go through and what they're capable of understanding. I put down clinic visits for those of you who are providers, either in this school clinic, and I say the school clinic because that's where they're visiting quite frequently. So we're looking at our frequent flyers, and you have to start putting the pieces of the puzzle together of why do they keep coming back to you. Hard to see this in an actual medical practice because you don't see the children that often, especially as they become middle school and high school. They maybe completed their immunizations, if they've done that, and then you don't see them again for well-child visits. So expect it. It is going to be in your school. It is going to be in your classroom. And like I said, how's it done? They target the vulnerable populations on the school grounds in several other places. Talking with a counselor the other day here on the island, it happens, I'm in elementary school, but which is where most of our special needs children are, but she says most of the reports they get, it's happening in the malls, as well as the schools, and it's in every school here, middle school, high school, and just scantily in elementary schools. Again, remembering that youngest victim, it can be as young as 9 years of age. Our social media that we have access to has changed everything. Our peers, our classmates, you've heard of the drug dealing and the distribution in the schools. Well, you have that as well, along with those that are going to work for the actual perpetrators. And of course, the relationships, the romances. Someone befriends you, they pretend they care about you, they love you, and youth are just so vulnerable to this, especially when they're not getting that attention, and the home life is pretty dysfunctional. And like I said, the psychological manipulation or intimidation is huge. Just a quick slide on how it happens, cyberbullying. I know you've all heard, and it continues to exist every day, about the pictures being posted, some doing their own selfies in response to, the boyfriend writes, hey, I really like you, I'd like to know more about you, could you send me a picture of yourself? So that's all part of grooming and luring the victim in. They start to spread lies or rumors about you. They pretend to be you online. I know you may not remember a case where a mother was pretending to be the boyfriend of a young girl. She took over his role on the internet and continued with threatening and inappropriate cyberbullying to the young lady, who eventually committed suicide. So it happens. Just a quick slide on how the internet works and how we need to educate our children on the internet. So they're online predators. That's part of the business, the cyberbullying, meeting someone. A couple of the acquaintances I have met and testimonies that I've heard was, the friend taking another friend to a party when in actuality they were grooming or setting up this young lady or young man and taken away and involve them in a situation where the trafficking exploitation begins. So what might it look like in our schools? You might see unexplained absences because they're out being trafficked, or they're home due to illnesses from those episodes, running away from home to get away from adverse trauma. They get involved in the juvenile justice system. So those are ones that could be flagged. You might see physical trauma, bruising, tattooing, all about ownership. Some of the victims are tattooed. And then there's also self-harm from just being a coping mechanism from the chronic stress, chronic trauma. Withdrawn behavior, being a loner, depressed. Other behaviors, just constant hyperarousal. Remember, you can't turn the engine off. it's revved up. It causes behavior that's inappropriate, and we have to look at that with a different lens. What's causing that behavior? Children don't want to act that way. They're not born to act that way. But when they know no different, and they have this toxic stress levels, it's inevitable. Relationships, are they dating an older boyfriend or girlfriend? And believe it or not, it's very common on the island here to have the girl, to have a woman or a girl as the perpetrator for the network. And I guess that goes back to grooming of a child, and easier done by a, quote, female than a male. Sudden changes in their attire or material possessions, which, you know, they couldn't afford typically. Acting out sexually, using language that is not normal language used by someone who's not been exposed to the exploitation. Sleeping problems, changes in academics. These are all red flags. Another quote, you'll miss the best things if you keep your eyes shut. So we got to keep our radars up. Talking about the vulnerable youth at risk, and I'm just listing the most prevalent ones, those with learning disabilities. Example there, I know you've heard on the news within the last 6 months of exploiting young victims with autism, other learning disabilities, where they've been exploited, raped, traumatized. Other ACEs in their life, the lack of social support or disconnectedness with anyone. And a group that is incredibly vulnerable is our foster care youth and our LGBTQ youth. And then we have other social determinants that make us so vulnerable. And then just by the fact that our growth and developmental stages are inherent, depending on what time during one of those stages that they are exploited. Screening, biggie. Lots of information and lots of controversy on whether we should do universal screening in our schools, in our workplaces, etc. What tool to use. So there are a lot of tools out there right now, and there are a lot in the development. And there's a lot of controversy about screening in and of itself. There are some that believe that we should not be screening because they worry about who's going to do the screening, what are we going to do with the results, do we have the resources to deal with our findings. And while all that's well and good, we've been screening for years for other things such as substance abuse and alcohol, and you just proceed with what you have available. Me personally, I don't feel like we need to wait. We do have to have some screening to identify these children. They have no one else. They are at our mercy. And it doesn't take a whole lot of shift in our thinking. We're already doing these things. Remember, trafficking is child abuse in its worst possible way. We can add on to those policies and protocols, and it only takes a few questions. So you hear the big one: what happened to you? Rather than coming up to a child, what's wrong with you? So what happened are those adverse events that have stacked up and stacked up and stacked up and caused the behavior you see. These are just some examples of ways that we can, different wording that we can use, which is all part of the trauma-informed care model.
Rhonda, excuse me, this is Lee. I just wanted to give you a time check and let you know that we have about 14 minutes left.
Okay, all right, thank you, ma'am. We'll speed up here. Okay, screening. So take care of their immediate needs. You know, do they need food? Do they need some clothing? Do they need various other basic needs that we can provide for them? Be sensitive to the terminology or the language you use. Most of the victims, they don't even understand. They've never even heard the term human trafficking before. So you can see where we need to be sensitive to the language. Expect different stories and inconsistencies with these children when you are screening or questioning them. Just don't dispute any comments or make any judgments, but just do a lot of listening. It may not be the first encounter with a child that you have in the health room or with a counselor. It may not be that first encounter that they're going to tell you the actual concern that's going on. It may take a while, so just listen and develop their trust and follow your intuition as you go along. So trauma-informed care, what is that? Where does all this ACEs led up to? Well, huge movement on trauma-informed care. It's basically a framework, a program, a system that realizes, that understands the impact of trauma and how to care for it. It requires teamwork, coordination, creativity, sharing the responsibility. I read about one program who will do the actual, they come to the actual school, they do coaching and just the whole implementation, and that basically takes about a year and a half process. There's a lot of work to do as far as changing the way we look at things, altering our attitudes, and above all, requires some great leadership to pull that off and create that infrastructure to happen. But it has happened, and it's continuing to happen, and it's already evidence-based, and outcomes have proven successful. So I'm not going to talk a lot about frameworks. There are a lot of different frameworks out there. And of course, do want to touch on the WSCC model that ASHA goes by as well. But they all have the same common threads. The whole school, the whole child, the whole community concept. It's student-centered. Youth are very engaged in the process. The family is included. The community is included. We realize that there needs to be more education and training on nurturing and learning of growth and development and how to be a parent. They understand that the strengthening mechanisms that it takes and enhancing you know, protective factors and coping skills to be able to cope with the chronic stress and what's happened to the brains. And of course, taking care of some basic needs. So what do I mean by protective factors? Social conditions or attributes that help lessen the risk of trauma. And the word you'll hear a lot about, resiliency, being able to bounce back from the stress or the challenge from all the adversity. It's a change of attitude, the ability to regulate our emotions, and the ability to see failure as being hopeful. And just to let you know, these resiliency and protective factors are core principles behind most of the frameworks. In fact, all of them. Without that, they're basically the foundation. So along with screening, many are doing tandem resiliency questionnaires to see where that particular individual is. And the most, the number one factor we need to look at is, do they have at least one close and secure person that they can rely upon? And that just may be you. And we'll touch on that as we go through. We talked about the concrete support, just meeting the basic needs. Consider case management. There's one school where the school nurse office is case managing just three students and their families, going out and doing home visits, doing education. It has improved outcomes remarkably. You do what you can with the resources you have. And again, centering on the strengths of the child and the family and building from there. And I'd just like to put a plug in here for the use of community health workers and peer mentors. I hope that we can continue to see the importance of those individuals as they're familiar with the communities. They're trusted individuals and they want to help. And there's a great deal of room for them within our frameworks for managing this problem. So just a couple of quotes. One by Dr. Kemp, a pediatrician who's now passed on, but he was a leading authority in the development of child abuse and developing child abuse laws. So there are families who love their children very much, but not very well. They don't know how. And Dr. Ross Green, who I've mentioned several times, and maybe not mentioned, but highlighted in several of these slides, in his work that he has continued to do over the years. And he said, kids do well if they can. So just keep those in mind. So community strategies, admitting the problem exists, we've got to develop a different attitude, awareness, prevention efforts, education with the parents or caregivers as well as the youth. Looking at law enforcement and our justice systems through a different lens rather than punishment. Again, looking beneath the behavior and being sensitive about the trauma. School strategies, we just need to begin to advocate for and begin to teach in these areas. We may not be full-blown providers as far as or have an environment or a climate that's trauma-informed, but we can begin small. And education is one of those that we need to think about and how we do that. school I'm in right now did away with their sexuality education because of all the standards and other items that are placed upon the teachers to provide, and it just got shoved back and is no longer available. So think about being that one person that they connect with. Know your community resources, know your state and district policies, protocols, and not to forget self-care. So trafficking legislation, we've got our TVPA that was in 2000, initiated in 2000. It's gone through several reauthorizations and then it's now up for another. Preventing sex trafficking and strengthening families has focus, again, is on prevention and working with the families. Safe harbor laws, not every state, which is state law, not every state has one, and its main focus is on helping the victim receive the services that are needed. So what are the implications behind our policy or legislative managements? Remember, I talked about the definitions. It's huge. Look at the language. Does it need to be changed? Know that most of us are mandated reporters. What does that mean for you in your workplace, your school? Think about expanding on that as part of the child abuse protocols that you already have. Know your state laws. Educate, continue to advocate. Got to say something about sexuality education and health promotion approaches. It's never too early to learn about giving consent, what consent is all about, boundaries in regards to touch. Teaching, it's all about teaching healthy lifestyle, talking about safe dating, talking about what's normal relationships. Relationships are not about date rape or abuse or viewing pornography. Understanding that sexuality education is part of our normal biological and social and emotional development. Too many people have I won't say too many, but many schools are not teaching that and just teaching abstinence, which we know doesn't have a whole lot of benefit as far as outcomes. So we have to think about it in a different manner. We have to look at it through a different lens. So education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world, and prevention programs and sexuality education is the basis for that. So our individual roles.
Rhonda, this is Lee. I just wanted to do a time check with you. We are coming close to the hour, but we're going to let you finish out your slides. I think you have about eight slides left. Okay. And we're gonna just not have the Q&A session, but if you don't mind, we'll let folks we'll send their questions to you, and you can respond to them. And for the folks that need to hop off, we will be recording this, so you'll get the link to the recording, and you can always listen then. But go ahead, Rhonda, and finish it out. Thank you.
Okay. So awareness, advocating, protocol development, keep up with your legislation. We need to start doing some screening. We need to think about adopting the care sensitivity in all our schools. Early intervention, case management, and again, taking care of ourselves, but be creative with the resources that you have. Another quote, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Any students that you have that you might be, that might be potential or actual victims, just think back. In summary, what is your takeaway? How will you respond if you're young enough in the profession, you're going to eventually run into a circumstance. So what will you do? We talked about parent and community engagement. Takes a village. Attitudes, looking at areas with a different lens, looking at this behavior through a different lens. Professional development in regards to what this is all about. I know a lot of our teachers out there they're overwhelmed. I hear it all the time. How can they respond to something they know nothing about or don't have the tools to deal with it? I'll pass that. So resources. I have tons of resources, and by no means these are not all. So if you have a particular, I know we're not going to do Q&A, if you have a particular question or item of interest and I don't have the resource in here, just let me know. I can lead you to the right source and be happy to get back with you. And the bottom piece is the keychain thing I was talking about through the blue campaign that I keep on my keychain, and I keep several of them to give out cab drivers, hotel workers, you name it. Okay, questions. I'm sorry we don't have time for the questions, but please do write me and let me know any concerns or questions or that I can help you with. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. I'm just going to cut in real quick, and thank you very, very much for the time that you took to put your slides together and to present them to our audience. This was a very, very popular topic. We had over 300 people register, and unfortunately, we could only allow 100 people to participate. So really appreciate that. I want to remind everybody that we have recorded this session, and we will send a follow-up email in the next couple of days that will include a link to the recording. It will include the slides. It will include an evaluation survey for those who are seeking continuing education. And so we'll be sure to share that with you. And I know that there was especially one individual who had a lot of questions that came through the system, and we will send those to Rhonda, and she can reply directly to that person to answer those questions. And if you all have any further questions that you want us to pass along to Rhonda, please don't hesitate to do so. We'll pass them on, and we'll make sure that she gets those questions answered for you. So thank you very much. At this point, we're going to go ahead and end the webinar. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Lee?